I spent 20 years sleeping next to a man who cheated, while I kept an even bigger secret that could destroy our entire family. You can't imagine what made me stay in that marriage. Hello, my dear viewers. My name is Dorothy Miller. I'm 78 years old, and today I'm going to share with you a story I've never told anyone, not even my children. It's a story of pain and deception, but also of overcoming. Before I begin, I'd like to ask you watching now to please leave a like on this video. It really helps this channel grow. If you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe now and hit the notification bell to receive more stories like mine. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing my words reach places I've never been able to visit. Now, let's get to my story. It was 1962. I had just turned 19. Back then, if a girl reached 20 without getting married, she was already considered an old maid in our small Midwestern town. My parents were getting worried. Then I met Gerald Foster at a 4th of July picnic. Gerald was 29, already owned a general store that sold a bit of everything. He was a respected man in town, had his own car, rare in those days, and all the mothers dreamed of having him as a son-in-law. When he started courting me, my parents were delighted. I was too, I confess. I was naive and thought I'd hit the jackpot. Our courtship was brief, only 4 months. Back then, there wasn't this business of dating for years. We soon set the wedding date. It was a beautiful ceremony by town standards. I was happy. I believed I had found the love of my life, that I would be an exemplary wife, and we would have a blessed family. The first few years were peaceful. Edward came first, our firstborn son. Then Catherine. Gerald worked hard, spent all day at the store, and sometimes traveled to buy merchandise in the city. I took care of the house and children, as was expected. We had a comfortable life without luxuries, but we didn't want for anything. It was in 1965, exactly 3 years after our wedding. I was pregnant with our 3rd child. That day I was washing Gerald's clothes to iron them. I always checked the pockets first to avoid damaging documents or money he might have forgotten. That's when I found a handkerchief with lipstick marks in his jacket's inner pocket. My heart raced. That lipstick wasn't mine, I was sure. It was a bright red that girls in town wouldn't dare use. I, at 22, only wore a very light pink, and even that just on special occasions. I couldn't sleep that night. Gerald snored beside me while my head swirled with thoughts. Maybe it was just a mistake. Maybe the handkerchief wasn't even his. Maybe a customer had dropped it in the store, and he picked it up out of courtesy. I tried to convince myself of this, but that incident awakened something in me. I started paying more attention to his schedules, his excuses to go out at night, the different perfume he sometimes brought home on his clothes. Everything I had previously ignored now jumped out at me. A week later, Gerald announced he needed to travel for 3 days to purchase merchandise. It wasn't unusual, but this time something told me there was more to the story. As soon as he left, I made a decision that would change my life forever: to search through his things. I'd never done that before. I was raised believing that a wife should not distrust her husband, that it was sinful, but that handkerchief with lipstick wouldn't leave my mind. With the children asleep, I went to Gerald's home office, a small room where he kept store documents and did the accounting. The desk had 3 drawers. In the first 2, I found only store papers, nothing suspicious. The 3rd was locked. Using a hairpin, I managed to open it after several attempts. Inside were more business papers, but something caught my attention. The bottom of the drawer seemed higher than it should be. Examining more closely, I discovered it was a false bottom. I removed it and found a bundle of letters tied with a red ribbon. My hands trembled when I untied that package. The first letter was signed, "Your Olivia Forever." The date was 2 months after our wedding. I won't lie to you. I read all the letters one by one. There were more than 20. All from Olivia to Gerald. I discovered she owned a boarding house in the neighboring town, 20 miles from ours. That's where Gerald stayed when he said he was going shopping. Their relationship began right after our wedding. In the first letters, she wrote about the guilt of getting involved with a married man. In the last ones, she was already talking about running away together, starting a new life when they had enough money. There were intimate details that broke my heart. References to moments they spent together, promises, declarations of eternal love. I remember sitting on the office floor until dawn with those letters scattered around me. I cried until I had no more tears. I felt betrayed, humiliated, destroyed. What hurt the most was knowing this had been happening since the beginning of our marriage. While I was at home, taking care of his children, pregnant for the third time, he was living a passion with another woman. I put the letters back exactly as they were. I returned the false bottom to its place and locked the drawer. I washed my face, prepared breakfast for the children, as if nothing had happened. On the outside, I was the same Dorothy as always. Inside, I was shattered. During the 3 days Gerald was away, I made the hardest decision of my life. Many women ask me why I didn't confront him, why I didn't ask for a divorce, why I stayed in that marriage. The answer is simple and complicated at the same time. I was 22, with 2 small children and another on the way. I hadn't studied beyond elementary school, had no profession, and was completely dependent on Gerald. My parents had died in a car accident the year before. I had nowhere to go, no way to support myself. And back then, a divorced woman was seen as a pariah in society. Doors would close for me and my children. Besides, divorce wasn't even officially legal in many states at that time. It would be a separation, a scandal that would stain my children's names forever. They would grow up as children of a separated woman, carrying that stigma. So I swallowed my pride, dried my tears, and decided to continue. I decided I would stay in that marriage for the sake of my children, until they grew up and could fend for themselves. Later I would think about what to do. When Gerald returned from his trip, I welcomed him with a smile on my face, as if I knew nothing. He brought me a small brooch as a gift, as he always did. Now I understood. They weren't gifts of love, they were gifts of guilt. That night, lying next to him, I made a silent vow. I would no longer be the naive and blind wife. I would look after my interests and those of my children. And if life offered me any happiness, however small, I would seize it without guilt. Little did I know that this decision would lead me down a path I never imagined traveling. A path that, 20 years later, would bring to light all the secrets I fought so hard to hide. It was around this time that James, Gerald's younger brother, returned to our town. He had gone to study accounting in the city and returned to work at his brother's store. James was different from Gerald in many ways. Younger, more educated, more attentive. While Gerald was a practical man of few words, James liked to talk, listen to music, read books. He soon noticed something was wrong with me. He saw my eyes swollen from crying in secret. He noticed my prolonged silences. One day, he found me alone in the kitchen and asked if I was okay. It was the first time in weeks that anyone had shown concern for me, that anyone had seen me beyond the function of wife and mother. I didn't tell him everything right away, of course. I just said I was feeling lonely, that Gerald worked too much, traveled too much. James listened attentively, without judging. After that day, he started coming to our house more often, always bringing something new for the children, always willing to talk to me. I didn't realize at the time, but that friendship was filling an immense void in my life, and without noticing, I was getting closer and closer to my brother-in-law, to the brother of the man who had broken my heart into pieces. I'll continue from where we left off. It was mid-1966. I was 23, and my third child, Abigail, had already been born. A beautiful girl with rosy cheeks and big, curious eyes. The children were growing up healthy, despite the storm raging inside my chest. James became a constant presence in our home. While Gerald spent more and more time at the store or on his business trips, James appeared almost daily, either to bring some order or to help with repairs around the house. He always had time to play with the children, always asked how I was doing. I remember well one afternoon when I was washing clothes in the backyard. The children were playing in the yard. Gerald was at the store. James appeared bringing a bag of fresh oranges. "Dorothy, I saw these oranges and remembered the kids liked them," he said, smiling in that shy way only he had. As I dried my hands on my apron, he looked at me differently. "You look worn out. Is something bothering you?" he asked. At that moment, something inside me collapsed. I started crying. I tried to hide my face, but couldn't control the sobs. James led me to the bench under the maple tree, away from the children's eyes. There, for the first time, I unburdened myself. I didn't tell him about the letters, didn't mention Olivia, but I said I knew about Gerald's affairs, that I was living a marriage of appearances, that I felt alone and betrayed. The words escaped between sobs, years of pent-up hurt, finally finding an outlet. He listened in silence, just holding my hand. When I finished, he said something I never forgot. "Dorothy, you deserve so much more than this. You deserve to be truly loved." Those words touched deep in my heart. How long had it been since I felt valued? How long since I'd been seen as a woman and not just as a mother or housewife? James's look at that moment made me feel beautiful again, desired, important. Nothing happened that day beyond that conversation. James respected my moment of fragility, helped take care of the children while I composed myself, and left when Gerald was about to arrive. But something had changed between us. An invisible bond had formed, a silent complicity. In the weeks that followed, I found myself anxiously waiting for James's visits. I took more care with my hairstyle. I chose my dress more carefully. Small vanities I had forgotten after years of a marriage that had turned into routine and disappointment. It was on a Sunday in August that everything changed between us. Gerald had traveled to buy merchandise, or at least that's what he said. James appeared late in the afternoon to bring medicine for Edward's cold. The children were already in bed. Night was slowly falling. I invited him for coffee. In the kitchen, while the water boiled, our eyes met. I don't know who made the first move. Maybe we moved at the same time. I just know that in an instant we were in each other's arms, in a desperate kiss, as if our lives depended on that moment. Was it wrong? Perhaps in the eyes of the world, yes. But at that moment, I could only think that, for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. Someone desired me, saw me, valued me. James whispered sweet words as he kissed my neck. He said he had secretly loved me since we were young, even before I met Gerald. Our first encounter was right there in the kitchen of the house I shared with his brother, quick, intense, desperate. Afterwards, sitting at the table with the forgotten coffee cooling in the cups, we talked about what had happened. Guilt weighed on both of us, but there was also relief, as if we had finally admitted a feeling that had been there for a long time, hidden. "This can't happen again," I said, though my entire body belied my words. "I know," he replied, holding my hands across the table, "but I also know I can't stay away from you anymore." We established strict rules, never in front of the children, never when there was the slightest risk of Gerald appearing. Our meetings would be rare, discreet, hidden from the town's eyes, which would not forgive such a scandal. But the heart has reasons that reason itself doesn't understand. What began as a moment of weakness transformed into something deeper. James wasn't just an escape from my loneliness. Over time, he became my confidant, my friend, my lover. In the moments when we were alone, he treated me like I'd never been treated before. He listened to my opinions, valued my thoughts, made me feel intelligent and desired. We created codes, specific moments to meet. If I hung a white sheet on the backyard clothesline, it meant it was safe for him to appear after the children were asleep. If he passed in front of the house with his hat in his right hand, it was a signal he would find a way to come at night. A simple system, but one that worked for years. James never married. He told everyone he was dedicated only to business. In truth, his life revolved around that family, his brother's family, the children he adored, the woman he secretly loved. He lived in a small room at the back of the store, a solitary existence in the eyes of society. Time passed, and with it grew our intimacy, our complicity. Meanwhile, Gerald continued his travels, his absences. If he noticed any change in me, he never commented. Perhaps he was too busy with his own double life to notice mine. In 1968, something happened that would further complicate our situation. I discovered I was pregnant again. The problem was that in recent months, I had been with both Gerald and James. I wasn't sure who was the father of the child growing in my womb. Panic overtook me. I told James as soon as I confirmed the pregnancy. He paled but didn't run from the responsibility. "If it's my child, I want to be part of their life, even if no one knows the truth," he said. When I told Gerald about the pregnancy, he seemed genuinely happy. In those days, more children meant more hands to work in the future, more security for the parents in old age. He didn't question, didn't suspect. Why would he? I was his faithful wife in the town's eyes, the exemplary mother of his children, the perfect housewife everyone admired. The months of pregnancy were filled with constant anxiety. I prayed the child would be born looking like Gerald, so there would be no doubts, so our secret would remain safe. James stayed close, helpful as always, taking care of the children, bringing special foods for his pregnant sister-in-law. No one suspected the real reason for so much attention. In January 1969, my fourth daughter, Leanne, was born. A strong, healthy girl with dark hair and big eyes. When I looked at her for the first time, my heart raced. She had James's chin, the same face shape, but she also had Gerald's nose, or was it the Foster family nose, shared by both brothers? On the day of the baptism, I observed the faces of both men as they looked at little Leanne. Gerald, proud as any father, held the girl in his arms to show friends and acquaintances. James, discreet as always, watched from afar, with a look that mixed love and sadness. That night, when everyone had gone, James found a moment for us to be alone. He looked at Leanne, sleeping in her crib, and whispered, "No matter whose daughter she is biologically, I will love her as I love Edward, Catherine, and Abigail. I will be present in her life, even if just as an uncle." The following years were a delicate balance, raising 4 children, maintaining the appearance of a normal marriage, hiding a relationship that could destroy our family and our place in the community. James became the children's favorite uncle, the one who brought presents, told stories, taught them to fish in the river. Gerald, always busy with the store, which was now expanding to a second location in the neighboring town, hardly noticed his brother's constant presence in his house. In 1971, something changed in the dynamics of our strange family. Olivia's letters stopped coming. During a cleanup in the office, I checked the false bottom of the drawer. The old ones were still there, but no new ones had been added. Gerald started spending more time at home, traveling less. Was it the end of his relationship with the boarding house owner? I never knew for sure, but I noticed a change in his behavior. He was more attentive, more present. This should have made me happy. It should have been an opportunity to rebuild our marriage. But it was too late. My heart belonged to another man, to my husband's brother. And that secret was becoming increasingly difficult to carry. Leanne grew up showing traits, sometimes of one, sometimes of the other foster brother. Sometimes I caught myself studying her face, looking for signs that might reveal her true paternity. James did the same, always discreetly. Gerald, completely oblivious to the situation, just took pride in the smart daughter who got good grades at school. One day, when Leanne was almost 4, Gerald made a casual comment during dinner. "This girl is the spitting image of my dad when he was young. Look at those eyes, that way of smiling. She's a genuine foster." James and I exchanged a quick glance, a moment of shared panic, but Gerald didn't notice, busy cutting meat on his daughter's plate. It was both a relief and an irony. The family resemblance that could have given us away was also our perfect protection. After all, who would question the similarity between uncle and niece when both came from the same lineage? The meetings with James became scarcer over time, but no less intense. Routine, growing children, increasing responsibilities. Everything conspired to make our moments alone more difficult. But we always found a way, even if just to talk, to exchange confidences, to keep alive that connection that had become essential to both of us. In 1975, Gerald decided to build a new house, larger, on a plot away from downtown. The store was prospering. He was now a man of means. The new house had rooms for each child, a spacious living room, a modern kitchen. For me, it represented a bigger prison, more beautiful, but still a prison. For James, it meant more difficulty in meeting us, since it was far from the store where he worked and lived. It was during this time that I began to wonder if I should tell the truth to the children, at least to Leanne. She had the right to know who her real father was, but would the truth only bring more pain, more confusion? James and I discussed this many times, always reaching the same conclusion. Silence was cruel, but the truth could be devastating. We decided to wait until she was an adult, until she could better understand the complexity of human relationships, the mistakes we made, the choices we made. Meanwhile, I lived in a precarious balance between two worlds, two loves, two lives. By day, I was Mrs. Foster, wife of the prosperous merchant Gerald, dedicated mother, exemplary housewife. In the rare stolen moments, I was just Dorothy, the woman who loved and was loved by James, who dreamed of a different life, with the freedom to love openly. The 70s brought changes to the country and our small town. Television arrived, bringing soap operas, news, a wider world. Women were beginning to work outside the home, to question their traditional roles. My oldest daughter, Catherine, talked about going to the city to study, something unthinkable in my youth. I observed these changes with a mixture of admiration and envy. What would my life have been like if I had been born a decade later? If I had had the opportunities my daughters now had? Perhaps I wouldn't be trapped in a marriage of appearances, divided between duty and desire, carrying a secret that weighed more with each year. What I didn't know was that this carefully maintained balance would soon begin to crumble. That a casual comment, a closer look, an unexpected coincidence would initiate the unraveling of a truth I had fought so hard to hide. Now I'll tell you when our house of cards began to shake. It was 1979. More than a decade had passed since the beginning of my relationship with James. Leanne, that girl whose paternity was always shrouded in silent doubt, was already 10 years old. Our family had prospered financially. Gerald now had 3 stores, 1 in our town and 2 in neighboring towns. James managed one of them, which meant he spent less time in our town. Our meetings had become even rarer, happening only when he came for business meetings or family celebrations. But the feeling remained intact. Each look exchanged during a Sunday lunch, each discreet touch of hands when no one was watching, were small moments that fed a love that had survived time and circumstances. The children were growing up fast. Edward, at 16, was already helping his father in the business. Catherine, at 15, dreamed of being a teacher. Abigail, 14, was quiet and studious. And Leanne was special. She had a strong personality, sharp intelligence, and a curiosity that sometimes frightened me. It was on a fall Sunday that something happened. We were celebrating Gerald's 47th birthday. The house was full, relatives, business friends, neighbors. I was serving people, moving between the kitchen and the living room, when I heard a comment that froze my blood. Mrs. Thompson, an elderly lady who had been the town's midwife for decades and knew all the families, was looking at Leanne, who was playing with cousins in the yard. That girl is the spitting image of James when he was little. I remember as if it were yesterday. I helped bring that boy into the world. Same smile, same way of furrowing her brow when she's concentrating. Other people around agreed without any malice. After all, it was natural for nieces to look like uncles, especially with brothers. But I noticed that Gerald, who was nearby, suddenly became thoughtful. He looked at his daughter, then at his brother, who was talking on the other side of the room. For a fleeting instant, I saw something in his eyes. A spark of doubt, perhaps. The moment passed. The party continued. But another seed had been planted. A small stone had begun rolling downhill. From that day on, I started noticing Gerald observing Leanne more attentively, studying her gestures, her expressions. A few weeks after that party, Gerald was organizing old photo albums. It was unusual. He had never been very interested in memories. I found him late at night in the living room, with photos spread across the table. Photos of him and James, their parents, next to recent photos of the children. "What are you doing, Gerald?" I asked, trying to sound casual, although my heart was beating fast. "Nothing important," he replied, hurriedly collecting the photos, "just organizing some memories." But I noticed he separated some photos, one of James as a teenager, and a recent one of Leanne. He put them in a desk drawer, locking it afterwards. That gesture left me uneasy for days. Gerald's behavior began to change subtly. He started coming home earlier, asking more questions about the children's day-to-day, especially Leanne's. He seemed to be more present, more observant. To anyone else, he would just be a more attentive father. To me, who kept that terrible secret, every gesture was cause for apprehension. I spoke with James about my concerns on a rare occasion when we managed to be alone. It was a Saturday afternoon. Gerald had traveled with Edward to solve problems at one of the stores, and the girls were at an aunt's house. James appeared with the excuse of bringing some documents his brother had requested. "I think he's suspicious," I told him in a low voice, even though we were alone in the house. "Since his birthday, when Mrs. Thompson commented on the resemblance between you and Leanne, he's been acting differently." James frowned, worried. "What exactly has he been doing?" "He watches the girl all the time. The other day he was comparing old photos of you with photos of her, and he's been asking strange questions about when she was born, about that period." James ran his hand through his hair, a gesture he always made when nervous. "We need to be extra careful, Dorothy. If he finds out, I can't even imagine what would happen." We both knew what was at stake. It wasn't just our forbidden relationship. It was the stability of an entire family, the reputation of all of us, the well-being of the children. In our small town, a scandal of that magnitude would destroy lives. "Maybe we should stay away for a while," suggested James, though his eyes said the opposite, until his suspicions calmed down. I agreed with a heavy heart. It was the sensible thing to do, although the idea of not being able to count on those brief moments of happiness was painful. We said goodbye with a restrained embrace, not knowing when we would have another opportunity to be alone. The following weeks were tense. Gerald seemed to always be nearby, observing, listening. James rarely appeared, and when he did, he kept his distance. The children noticed the change in the home environment. "Mom, is Dad angry about something?" Catherine asked me one night while helping me wash the dinner dishes. "No, honey, he's just worried about work," I replied, forcing a smile that didn't convince even myself. The winter of 1979 was particularly cold, not only because of the weather, but also the atmosphere in our home. Christmas was approaching, traditionally a time when the whole family gathered, including James, who always spent the holidays with us since he had no family of his own. On Christmas Eve, as I prepared the feast, Gerald appeared in the kitchen with an envelope in his hand. "Dorothy, I need to talk to you," he said, with a seriousness that frightened me. I dried my hands on my apron, trying to control the tremor that was beginning to take over my body. "What is it, Gerald?" He placed the envelope on the table. "Yesterday, I went to the downtown store to get some documents. The drawer of James's desk was open. I found this." With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope. Inside was a photo of me, taken years before at a family picnic. On the back, in James's unmistakable handwriting, was written, "To my Dorothy, the love that destiny denied me, eternally yours, J." The world seemed to collapse around me. That photo, that dedication, how could James be so careless? How could he keep something so compromising? I looked at Gerald, expecting to see fury in his eyes. Instead, I saw something worse: pain, disappointment, disbelief. "It's true, then?" he asked in a low, contained voice. You and my brother? I couldn't answer. The knot in my throat prevented the words from coming out. Silent tears began to run down my face. How long, Dorothy? How long have you been betraying me with my own brother? Finally, I found a voice to speak. Gerald, I can explain. Explain what? That you sleep with my brother behind my back, that you make a fool of me in front of the whole town. You were the first to betray, I said, the words escaping before I could contain them. With Olivia from the boarding house, since the beginning of our marriage. He paled. What are you talking about? The letters, Gerald. The letters you keep in the false bottom of the desk drawer. I found them years ago. I know everything about you and Olivia. It was his turn to be speechless. For a long moment, we stood there in the kitchen that smelled of Christmas dinner. Two strangers who had shared a life for almost 20 years, finally confronting the lies that had sustained that union. So that's why, he finally said, his voice loaded with bitterness. Is it out of revenge that you slept with my brother? To punish me? I shook my head. No, Gerald. At first, maybe. I was hurt, feeling betrayed, but then it became more than that. A heavy silence fell between us. Outside, we could hear the voices of the children arriving from their aunt's house, excited about the approaching Christmas. The world continued turning, oblivious to the earthquake shaking our family. Leanne, Gerald said suddenly, as if a final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. She's not my daughter, is she? I wanted to lie. I wanted to protect that last barrier, that secret that could crumble everything that remained. But I was tired of lies, tired of living in the shadows. I don't know, I answered honestly. She might be yours, she might be his. We've never been sure. Gerald closed his eyes as if trying to absorb the blow. When he opened them again, I saw determination in his gaze. I want him out of my house, out of my business, out of our lives. Today. Gerald, please. It's Christmas Eve. The children will notice. They'll ask questions. I don't care, he cut me off. I'm not going to spend Christmas with the man who slept with my wife and may have made me raise his child as my own. He has 1 hour to pack his things and leave the store. If he doesn't go willingly, he'll go forcefully. And what about the children? What will we tell them? For now, nothing. We'll say James had an emergency, that he had to travel. Later we'll decide what to do. The children entered at that moment, bringing the buzz of youth to that kitchen loaded with tensions. Gerald forced a smile, caressed Leanne's head when she ran to hug him, acting as if he hadn't just discovered she might not be his daughter. Later he left, telling the children he needed to resolve an urgent matter. I knew he was going to confront James, to expel him from the life he had built in our town. I stayed at home preparing the feast with automatic movements, trying to maintain normalcy for the children, while inside I was shattered. When Gerald returned, hours later, his face was closed, his eyes red. From anger or crying, I couldn't tell. It's done, he said in a low voice, so only I could hear. He's gone. That was the saddest Christmas dinner of my life. The children noticed the absence of their beloved uncle, asked questions. Gerald told the story we had agreed upon, an emergency, an unexpected trip. But the atmosphere was heavy, the Christmas joy completely absent from our home. When everyone was already asleep, Gerald came to find me in the kitchen, where I was finishing putting away the dinner leftovers. I don't want to share the bedroom with you anymore, he said, without beating around the bush. I'll sleep in the office from now on. I nodded in silence. It was expected. In fact, it surprised me that he still wanted to keep up appearances, continue living under the same roof. Why do we stay together then? I finally asked. For the children, he replied without hesitating. They don't deserve to grow up in the middle of a scandal. They don't deserve to carry this burden. We'll continue as we are until the youngest is old enough. Then each one goes their own way. And what about Leanne? I dared to ask. What will we do about her? Gerald hardened his gaze. She is my daughter. I raised her. I supported her. I loved her for 10 years. It doesn't matter whose blood runs in her veins. She is a foster, my daughter, and will continue to be so. Never touch on this subject again." With that final declaration, he left the kitchen, leaving me alone with my thoughts, my regrets, my uncertain future. Christmas 1979 marked the end of one era in our family and the beginning of another, one based no longer on secrets and lies, but on a painful truth that no one was fully prepared to face. And what about James? Where did he go? What happened to him after that fateful night? Well, that's part of the next chapter of our story, a chapter marked by more revelations, more pain, but also, finally, by some form of redemption. Difficult years of oppressive silence, of forced coexistence, but which also brought maturity and eventually the truth that Leanne deserved to know. January 1980 arrived with a cold that wasn't just from the weather. Our house, once full of voices and movement, became a place of heavy silences and polite, superficial conversations. Gerald and I were two strangers, sharing the same roof, pretending a normalcy that no longer existed. The children, of course, noticed the change. Especially the older ones, Edward and Catherine, now teenagers, noticed something was wrong. They asked questions about Uncle James's whereabouts, about why Dad now slept in the office, about why there were no more Sunday lunches with the family gathered. "Your uncle had to move away to manage a new store," we explained. "Dad has a backache, and the doctor recommended he sleep on a firmer bed," I invented. "We're too busy for family gatherings now," Gerald evaded. Excuses, half-truths, little lies that added to the big ones. Were we protecting the children or ourselves? Sometimes I couldn't tell. Gerald immersed himself in work like never before. He left early, returned late, spent weekends visiting stores in other towns. I dedicated myself entirely to the children and the house, seeking in routine an anchor to not get lost in the sea of regrets and guilt that assailed me. As for James, it was as if he had disappeared from the face of the earth. Gerald never mentioned his name, had forbidden any contact. I later discovered he had moved to a coastal town hundreds of miles away. I learned this from a letter I received 6 months after his departure. The letter arrived on a rainy winter day. The mailman delivered it directly into my hands. A simple envelope, no return address. I immediately recognized the handwriting on the front. I hid it in my apron pocket, my heart racing. I could only read it hours later, locked in the bathroom, the only part of the house where I had any privacy. James wrote that he was well, that he had opened a small business in the coastal town, that he thought of us every day. He asked about Leanne, about how she was growing, if she was showing talents or preferences yet. He said he was sorry for what had happened, for the pain we caused so many people, but that he didn't regret the years we spent together. They had been the light of his life. I cried silently, reading those words, feeling a mixture of longing and relief to know he was moving forward. At the end of the letter, he left an address in case I wanted to reply, but asked me to be careful, not to put a return address, to use a different name. I replied to the letter. Of course, it was dangerous, risky, but I needed that contact, that connection with someone who really knew me, who knew who I was beneath the mask of perfection I continued to wear before society. We thus began a clandestine correspondence that lasted for years. Hidden letters, read in secret, destroyed afterward. It was risky, but it was also my only consolation in that life of appearances I led. Meanwhile, the children grew. Life continued. Edward, at 18, decided to follow in his father's footsteps in business. Catherine finished high school and went to study education in the city, the first in the family to seek higher education. Abigail, always quiet and observant, helped me with household chores and dreamed of being a nurse. And Leanne was a case apart, intelligent, questioning, with a strong personality that sometimes reminded me of James in his most intense moments. At 12, she was already showing a special talent for drawing and painting, something neither Gerald nor I had, but that James possessed in abundance. Gerald observed this development with a divided look. On one hand, he took pride in the girl's talents, encouraging her by buying painting materials, hanging her drawings in the store. On the other, each resemblance to James she showed was like a knife twisted in his wound. In 1982, news again shook our family. Olivia, the woman with whom Gerald had maintained the extramarital relationship at the beginning of our marriage, died in a car accident. The news reached us through the regional newspaper where her obituary was published. It didn't mention Gerald, of course, but listed among the bereaved a son, Arnold. Arnold, a name I had never heard before, but whose meaning I immediately understood. Gerald had a son with Olivia, a son who was now motherless. I confronted him with the newspaper in hand after the children had gone to bed. He didn't deny it. "Yes, Arnold is my son," he admitted with a calmness that surprised me. "He's 19 now." 19 years? So he was born right after our wedding. Yes, Olivia was already pregnant when we got married, only discovered it afterward. The revelation hit me like lightning. While I suffered from his betrayal, imagining it was just an affair, an adventure, there was a son, a parallel family. "Have you kept in touch with them all this time?" I asked, trying to control my voice. "Yes," he answered straightforwardly. "I visited them when I said I was going on business. I helped financially. Arnold knows I'm his father." "And now? What will happen to him?" Gerald sighed, running his hand through his hair, which was already beginning to show gray strands. "He's going to come live with me in the house I bought in the neighboring town, where I manage the second store." So that was it. The house he had bought 2 years ago, where he spent more and more time, wasn't just to be close to work, as he said. It was to build another life away from me, away from the lies we had created together. "I understand," was all I said. And I really did understand. After all we'd done to each other, who were we to judge? The revelation about Arnold brought a strange truce between Gerald and me. The lies were now all on the table, the secrets exposed. We were both guilty, both victims of the choices we made. We began to talk more, not as husband and wife, but as partners in a difficult enterprise, raising our children well, despite everything. We decided we would keep up appearances until the youngest turned 18. Then we could go our separate ways, without scandals, without trauma for them. Time passed, as it always does, indifferent to human dramas. Leanne grew up, becoming a talented and restless teenager. At 14 in 1983, she began to ask more specific questions about James. Where was the uncle she had adored so much as a child? Why had he never come to visit them again? Why did no one talk about him? We evaded, gave vague answers, but Leanne wasn't an easy girl to deceive. The more we avoided the subject, the more interested she became. One day, I found her in Gerald's office, rummaging through drawers. "What are you doing here?" I asked, frightened. "Looking for answers," she said with a disarming frankness. "You don't tell me the truth, so I have to discover it on my own." "What truth, honey? I don't know what you're talking about." She stared at me with those penetrating eyes, so similar to James's. "I know something serious happened between Dad and Uncle James. I know that's why he left, and I know it has something to do with me." I froze. How could she know? Who had said something? "Why do you think it has to do with you?" "Because Dad looks at me differently. I've noticed how he observes my drawings with a strange expression, as if he's seeing someone else. And because I found this." She took from her pocket an old photograph. It was James at 15, next to a photo of herself taken recently. The resemblance was undeniable, especially in the smile, in the shape of the eyes. "Where did you find this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "In the locked drawer. I learned to open locks. It's not difficult," she explained, with a casualness that contrasted with the gravity of the moment. "Mom, he's my father, isn't he? Uncle James is my biological father." At that moment, all the years of lies, of secrets, collapsed. I looked at my daughter, our daughter, mine and James's, and saw that I could no longer hide the truth. She deserved to know, deserved to understand why she had grown up in a house full of silences and furtive glances. "Let's talk," I said, leading her to my room where we would have privacy. "There's a lot you need to know." That afternoon, I told Leanne a softened version of our story. I talked about how Gerald and I had grown apart, how James got closer, how we fell in love. I explained that when I discovered the pregnancy, I wasn't sure about the paternity, and that, out of love for her, we decided to keep the secret to protect her. "So you're not sure?" "I could be the daughter of either one," she asked, processing the information. "Exactly. And for Gerald, it doesn't matter. He raised you, loved you. You're his daughter in everything that really counts." "But Uncle James, does he know about this possibility?" "Yes, he knows, and he loves you very much too. He always has." "Where is he now? I want to meet him. I mean, meet him for real, knowing what I know now." I hesitated. Gerald would be furious if he knew about this conversation, even more so if I facilitated a meeting between Leanne and James. But looking at my daughter's determined face, I knew I couldn't deny her this. "He lives in a coastal town." "I have the address," I admitted, thus revealing that I had maintained contact with James all those years. Leanne's eyes sparkled. "I want to write to him, and I want to visit him when possible." "Your father, Gerald, can't know," I warned. "He still suffers a lot from all of this." "I understand," she said with surprising maturity for her 14 years. "It will be our secret for now." Thus began another phase of our complicated family history. Leanne began exchanging letters with James, telling him about her life, her dreams, her artistic talents. He responded with the same enthusiasm, sharing stories from his own youth, giving advice, nurturing her passion for art. In 1985, when Leanne turned 16, we organized her first meeting with James. We invented a school trip to a museum in the city, and from there she took a bus to the coastal town. I spent days anxious, fearing Gerald would discover that something would go wrong, that Leanne would be disappointed. When she returned, 3 days later, her eyes were shining in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. "He's amazing, Mom," she told me excitedly. "We have the same tastes, the same mannerisms. He showed me the paintings he makes. They're beautiful. He promised to teach me new techniques." The meeting was such a great success that they became regular. Every 6 months, we invented an excuse for Leanne to travel to James. Art courses, museum visits, exhibitions. Gerald, absorbed in his own problems and in building his new life with his newly discovered son, didn't question much. It was during one of these visits, when Leanne was 17, that James suggested something that would again change the course of our family history. "There are tests now," Leanne told me upon returning. "Tests that can determine with certainty who my biological father is. Uncle James, maybe my father, says we can do them if I want to know the definitive truth." Paternity tests were starting to become more accessible in America, although they were still expensive and performed only in large centers. Leanne wanted to take the test. She wanted to be sure. "And if the result shows that Gerald is your biological father?" I asked, concerned about how she would react. "It won't change anything," she replied with conviction. "James will continue to be important in my life. And if he is my biological father, well, it will just be confirmation of what I already feel in my heart." The decision was made. It remained now to face Gerald, to tell him about Leanne's contact with James during all those years, about her desire to take the test. It would be a difficult, potentially explosive conversation, but it was necessary. Our daughter deserved to know the truth after so many years living in a fog of uncertainties and half-truths. How did that conversation happen? How did Gerald react? And what did the paternity test reveal? It was July 1986. Leanne had just turned 17. The paternity test was scheduled for the next month at a laboratory in the city. Before that, however, we had a barrier to overcome. Tell the truth to Gerald, obtain a sample from him for the test, and prepare him for the possibility of discovering he was not the biological father of the daughter he had raised with so much love. I spent weeks mentally rehearsing that conversation. How to tell a man that his daughter maintained secret contact with his brother, the same man who had betrayed him with his wife. How to ask him to participate in a test that could confirm his greatest pain. It was Leanne who took the initiative. One night, when we were having dinner, just the three of us, the other children had already left home following their own lives, she put her silverware on her plate and said, with the firm voice she had inherited, I don't know from which of the Foster brothers, Dad, we need to talk about Uncle James. I saw Gerald pale. His brother's name had not been pronounced in our house for years. It was like invoking a ghost, a painful presence we all pretended didn't exist. There's nothing to talk about him, Gerald replied dryly. Oh, yes, there is, Leanne insisted. I know everything, Dad. I know about you, about Mom, about him. I know I might be his biological daughter, not yours. The silence that followed was the densest I had ever experienced. Gerald looked at me, a silent accusation in his eyes. You told her? It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. She discovered it on her own, Gerald. She's a smart, observant girl. She saw the photos, noticed the similarities. I've been keeping in contact with Uncle James for 3 years, continued Leanne, taking the responsibility. It was my decision. Don't blame Mom. I had the right to know him, to know who he is. Gerald rose abruptly from the table, his face contorted into a mask of anger and pain. I thought he was going to shout, to lose control, as he had that Christmas night years before. Instead, he did something I had never heard him do in all our years of marriage. He cried. Deep sobs shook his shoulders as he stood with his back to us, leaning against the dining room wall. Leanne and I exchanged looks of surprise and concern. Dad, she began, standing up and approaching him cautiously. You are my daughter, he said between sobs. Mine. I changed your diapers, taught you to walk, held your hand on your first day of school. No one can take that away from me. No one. Leanne hugged him from behind, resting her head on his shoulder. No one will take it away, Dad. You will always be my father, no matter what a blood test says. But I need to know the truth. I need that certainty to move forward. Slowly, Gerald calmed down. We returned to the table. The three of us, the dinner forgotten. We told him everything. How Leanne had discovered the secret. How she started exchanging letters with James. The secret visits. The decision to take the test. Surprisingly, after the initial emotional explosion, Gerald listened to everything with a calmness that disconcerted me. When Leanne finished speaking, he remained silent for long moments, as if digesting every word. Did you forgive him? He finally asked, looking at me. Did you forgive James for what he did? For what you two did? The question caught me off guard. Forgive. I had never thought in those terms. I don't know if it's a matter of forgiveness, Gerald. We all made mistakes in this story. You, me, James. We all hurt each other. And you? He asked Leanne. Do you forgive me for keeping you away from him all these years? For lying to you? Leanne smiled sweetly. There's nothing to forgive, Dad. You did what you thought was right at the time. You were hurt, wounded. Anyone would have reacted the same way. Gerald nodded thoughtfully. This test, when will it be? Next month in the city. And if I refuse to participate? Then we'll just do it with James, I replied. The result won't be conclusive, but it will give some indication. He sighed deeply. No, if we're going to do this, we'll do it right. I want to be there. I want to look my brother in the eyes after all these years. I want to understand how all this happened. That's how, on a hot morning in August 1986, the four of us met in the waiting room of a laboratory in New York City. It was the first time in almost 7 years that Gerald and James had seen each other. The initial meeting was tense, formal, rigid handshakes, cautious looks. James had aged, gray hair at his temples, deeper lines around his eyes. Gerald was also no longer the vigorous man of before. Gallbladder surgery the previous year had left him thinner, more fragile. Side by side, however, it was still possible to see the resemblance between the brothers, the same strong chin, the same face shape. And Leanne, standing between them, seemed to be the materialization of that blood tie, traits from one, gestures from the other, a living bridge between two men who were once so close. The procedure was quick. Blood collection, signing papers. The result would take a few weeks. We left the laboratory in an uncomfortable silence, none of us knowing exactly how to proceed. It was Leanne who broke the ice. "I'm starving. Can we have lunch together? I know a restaurant nearby." Gerald and James exchanged surprised looks. Both seemed about to refuse. But something in Leanne's hopeful face, that girl whom both loved, each in his own way, made them yield. The lunch began awkwardly, with superficial conversations about the weather, the food, the trip. Gradually, however, the tension diminished. Leanne told them about her plans to study arts in college. James mentioned the small gallery he had opened in the coastal town. Gerald talked about how Edward was taking on more responsibilities in the stores. At one point, I caught myself observing the scene with a strange sensation. There we were, the four protagonists of a story of betrayal and secrets, talking almost like a normal family. There was a fragile truce in the air, a tacit agreement of civility in the name of Leanne. When we said goodbye, James invited Gerald to visit his art gallery someday. Gerald didn't accept immediately, but neither did he refuse. "Maybe," he said simply. It was more than any of us expected. The following weeks were of anxious waiting. Leanne alternated between moments of excitement about finally discovering the truth and periods of nervousness about how this would affect her relationship with the two men she considered fathers. Gerald was strangely calm. One night I found him in the office, looking at old photo albums. "You know," he said without looking up, "I've been thinking a lot these last days about Leanne, about you and James, about everything that happened." I sat down beside him, uncertain about what to say. "I think I always knew deep down," he continued, "ever since she was born. There was something about her, in the way she looked, smiled, that reminded me of James when we were children. I tried to ignore it, convince myself it was just the family resemblance. Gerald, Let me finish," he interrupted gently. "What I want to say is that maybe the test will just confirm what my heart already knows, and I'm starting to accept that. How can you, after everything that happened?" He gave a sad smile. "I have my own secrets, Dorothy, my own regrets. Arnold, my son with Olivia, is 24 now. A grown man who grew up without a present father, only with occasional visits. When Olivia died and he came to live with me, I had to face the consequences of my choices." And how is he?" I asked, realizing we almost never talked about Gerald's other son. "Well, he's a good boy, intelligent, managing the store in the neighboring town now. He wants to meet his half-siblings someday, especially Leanne. They're almost the same age." The mention of half-siblings brought to the surface a reality I tried not to think about. Our family was much more complex and fragmented than anyone could imagine looking from the outside. The test result arrived on a rainy Tuesday in September. Leanne was at school. Gerald and I opened the envelope together in the silence of the dining room, where we had shared so many tense meals. The document was full of technical terms, numbers, percentages, but the conclusion was clear. There was a 99.9% probability that James was Leanne's biological father. Gerald read and reread the paper as if expecting the words to magically change. Finally, he folded it carefully and returned it to the envelope. "Well," he said, his voice surprisingly firm, "now we know." "How are you feeling?" I asked, concerned about his reaction. "Strangely at peace," he replied after a pause. "As I said before, I think I already knew. And these last few days have made me think a lot about family, about fatherhood, about what it really means to be a father." That night, when Leanne came home from school, we told her the result. She listened in silence, her eyes passing from me to Gerald, trying to assess how he was receiving the news. "Does this change anything between us, Dad?" she finally asked, her voice small, almost childlike. Gerald approached her, took her hands in his. "You are my daughter, Leanne. You always have been. You always will be. A piece of paper can't change that." She hugged him, crying silently. Over her shoulder, Gerald looked at me and nodded slightly. A silent understanding passed between us. It was time to leave the past behind, to move forward, for Leanne, for ourselves. In the weeks that followed, a subtle transformation began in our family. Gerald called James, told him about the test result. He invited him to come to our town for a Sunday lunch, the first in almost 7 years. James accepted hesitantly. When he arrived, he brought gifts for everyone, including Gerald, a set of antique brushes he had found in an antique store, knowing about his brother's recent interest in painting, a hobby that Leanne had encouraged him to try. The lunch was less tense than expected. Edward and Catherine were invited along with their respective spouses. Abigail came with her fiancé. Even Arnold was present, finally meeting his half-siblings. It was a strange family reunion, unconventional, marked by complex stories that everyone knew but no one mentioned directly. But there was also laughter, conversation, a sense that, despite everything, we were a family, different, broken and mended in several places, but still a family. In the years that followed, a new normalcy was established. Gerald and I remained legally married, although we lived separate lives. He spent more time in the other town with Arnold. I stayed in the original house, where Leanne lived until she went to college. James continued to live on the coast, but he visited regularly. He and Gerald never fully recovered the closeness they had before, but they managed to establish a civilized, even sometimes friendly relationship, united by their love for Leanne. In 1990, when Leanne graduated in arts, the three of us were there, me, Gerald, and James, sitting side by side in the auditorium, proudly applauding when she received her diploma. A photograph from that day, the four of us together smiling for the camera, is framed in my living room to this day. It is the symbol of the long and difficult journey we traveled. Today, so many years later, I look back and see how extraordinary our story was, full of mistakes, pain, questionable choices, but also love, forgiveness, growth. Gerald passed away in 2005 from a heart attack. Before leaving, he had made peace not only with James, but with himself. James is still with us at 84, living in a small house that Leanne built for him on the grounds of her property. And as for me, well, at my 78 years, I have the privilege of being surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a great-grandchild. When I look at them, I see traits of Gerald, of James, my own traits, all mixed in new combinations, new lives that continue our story. If there's a lesson I learned in this entire journey, it's that truth, however painful it may be, is always the path to liberation. We lived for years trapped in lies, in secrets, in silences that corroded us from within. It was only when everything came to the surface, when we faced the truth head-on, that we finally managed to find some peace. And that's why I decided to share my story with you. Not to justify myself, not to seek absolution for my mistakes, but to show that even in the most complex and painful situations, there is always a path to reconciliation with others, and, mainly, with ourselves. Thank you for accompanying me on this journey, for listening with an open heart to a story of mistakes and redemption. If anything I shared can help someone who is going through similar situations, it will have been worth it. Leave your like if this story touched your heart. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. And always remember, it's not our mistakes that define us, but how we choose to deal with them, how we choose to grow from them. Until next time, God willing. May He bless each one of you.